At 9:47 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The room was dim, windowless, and cold, chilled deliberately to protect the IBM tabulating machines lining the walls. In front of him hung a massive map of the Pacific Ocean, covered in colored pins and grease pencil markings. Each marker represented an American warship operating within 1,000 miles of Midway Atoll. Rochefort had not slept for 36 hours. His eyes were raw and bloodshot from endless hours of studying intercepted Japanese radio traffic. His head throbbed from caffeine and exhaustion. He had forgotten the last time he had eaten a proper meal. None of that mattered now. Everything rested on the next 90 minutes. Somewhere far to the west, American dive bombers were already airborne. They were flying on a narrow margin of fuel, navigating across open ocean with no visual landmarks. In approximately an hour and a half, they would either locate the Japanese carrier fleet, or they would turn back, out of fuel and out of chances. If they found the enemy, the United States Navy might still survive. If they did not, Japan would likely dominate the Pacific Ocean for the next decade. Rochefort knew exactly what was at stake, because he knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was heading. For 6 months, he and his team had worked relentlessly to break Japan's most secure naval code. They slept on cots, worked in shifts that blurred together, and argued constantly over fragments of decoded messages. Slowly, piece by piece, the picture became clear. The Japanese force approaching Midway was enormous. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers. It was the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Rochefort knew its composition, its timing, and its objective. He knew all of this because Station Hypo had penetrated the Japanese naval code known as JN-25B. But intelligence alone did not win battles. Knowledge meant nothing if American pilots failed to find the enemy. Japanese leaders did not believe that was possible. For months, Japanese admirals had openly dismissed American capabilities. They believed Americans were undisciplined, poorly trained, and incapable of sophisticated naval warfare. Japanese pilots were convinced they were superior in spirit, tactical understanding, and tactical endurance. Pearl Harbor reinforced that belief. Every victory afterward seemed to confirm it. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore collapsed in just over 2 months. The Philippines resisted longer, but still fell. Everywhere Japan advanced, Allied forces retreated. To Japanese planners, it appeared inevitable. Even Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto shared this view. Yamamoto had spent years living in the United States. He studied at Harvard after the First World War and later served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industry, American politics, and American society better than almost any Japanese officer. Yet he also came to believe that American naval officers were complacent, less professional, less committed, and too accustomed to comfort. That assumption shaped everything. At Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto believed American carriers would be tied to their docks, following predictable routines. At Midway, he believed American forces would react slowly, cautiously, and conventionally. Confident in Japanese superiority, he scattered his fleet across millions of square miles of ocean, assuming American intelligence would never detect it in time. The cost of that assumption became apparent early in the war.
On the night of December 7, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese destroyers Sazanami and Ushio approached Midway Atoll under cover of darkness. At 9:31 p.m., their guns opened fire on Sand Island. The attack was executed with casual confidence. There was no air cover, no detailed reconnaissance, no battleship support. The Japanese expected little resistance. They were wrong. First Lieutenant George Cannon commanded Battery H, responsible for defending the southern approach to Midway's airfield. Early in the bombardment, a Japanese shell slammed directly into his command post. The explosion destroyed his left leg and tore shrapnel through his body. His men tried to carry him away. Cannon refused. Despite massive blood loss, he remained at his position, issuing fire commands and correcting aim. For 40 minutes, Battery H continued firing under his direction. Multiple hits were scored. Both Japanese destroyers were damaged and forced to withdraw earlier than planned. Cannon lost consciousness shortly after midnight and died from his wounds. He was 26 years old. He became the first Marine of World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. The official report described his courage. It did not describe the Japanese overconfidence that made the attack possible in the first place. This pattern repeated itself across the Pacific. Japan won, but never as easily as expected. Wake Island held out far longer than anticipated. Bataan consumed men and supplies for months. Even defeated garrisons inflicted damage that Japanese planners had not accounted for. Each victory came at a cost Tokyo could not afford. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood this reality. From Pearl Harbor, he studied Japanese movements carefully. He saw that Japan's victories were tactical, not strategic. Supply lines were stretched thin. Carrier pilots were irreplaceable. Forces were scattered across vast distances. And Nimitz possessed something Yamamoto did not fully appreciate: codebreakers. Joseph Rochefort was not a conventional officer. Born in Dayton, Ohio in 1900, he enlisted in the Navy during World War I without finishing high school. Through sheer ability, he earned a commission and discovered a talent for intelligence work. The Navy sent him to Japan for language training in the late 1920s and again in the early 1930s. By 1931, Rochefort was among a small group of Americans fluent in Japanese, deeply familiar with Japanese culture, and skilled in cryptanalysis. He was placed in charge of Station Hypo, the Navy's radio intelligence center at Pearl Harbor. Hypo was cramped, uncomfortable, and chronically understaffed. About 40 people worked there: cryptanalysts, linguists, radio operators, clerks, and even musicians from the battleship California. Rochefort believed musicians understood patterns instinctively. Experience proved him right. Breaking JN-25B was painstaking. Messages arrived as meaningless strings of numbers. Additive tables changed constantly. Even partially decoded messages required cultural insight to interpret correctly. Before Pearl Harbor, Hypo could read only a small fraction of Japanese traffic. But by June 1942, that small fraction would be enough to change the course of the war.
That level of access was still not enough to provide reliable tactical warning of an attack. Before Pearl Harbor, partial decrypts offered insight, but rarely certainty. After December 7th, everything changed. The stakes were no longer abstract, they were existential. Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo worked without pause. They slept in rotating shifts, ate meals at their desks, and went days without seeing sunlight. The basement became their entire world. Rochefort himself adopted a peculiar working uniform, a red smoking jacket and worn carpet slippers, chosen for comfort during marathon sessions that stretched late into the night. To his staff, Rochefort seemed eccentric. To his superiors in Washington, he appeared undisciplined, even insubordinate. He ignored both judgments. Rochefort cared about only one thing: breaking Japanese naval codes fast enough to save American lives. By April 1942, Station Hypo could read roughly 40% of Japanese naval communications. That still left dangerous gaps, but it was enough to reveal patterns, enough to detect preparations for large-scale operations, enough to see something coming. In early May, Rochefort noticed a sudden increase in traffic referring to an operation scheduled for early June. The messages described the movement of major forces, multiple carrier divisions, battleship formations, cruiser squadrons, and an invasion group. This was not a raid, it was not a reconnaissance in force, it was a full-scale offensive. The target was referred to only by a code designation: AF. Rochefort began analyzing every mention of AF. Previous Japanese communications had used single-letter designators for locations in the Central Pacific. The letter A matched known regional coding practices. The added F corresponded closely with geographic coordinates that aligned with Midway Atoll. Additional clues followed. Japanese reconnaissance reports referenced weather conditions at AF. Those conditions matched Midway precisely. Other messages mentioned landing forces and the construction of amphibious-type facilities, clear indicators of an amphibious invasion. Everything pointed to Midway. But Washington disagreed. Captain John Redman, head of Naval Communications Intelligence in Washington, believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands or possibly the U.S. West Coast. Other analysts suggested Port Moresby. Some even argued Hawaii itself was the true target. Conflicting assessments flooded Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz faced the same confusion. He only had 3 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese had at least 6, possibly 8. If Nimitz concentrated his carriers at Midway and the Japanese struck elsewhere, the real target would be left undefended. If he spread his forces to cover multiple possibilities, they would be destroyed one by one. When the Japanese struck, Nimitz had to be right. One wrong decision could lose the war. Rochefort needed proof, something undeniable, something the Japanese themselves would confirm. On May 19, 1942, Rochefort proposed a deception plan to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer. Rochefort and Layton had trained together in Japan years earlier. They trusted one another completely. The plan was simple and elegant. Midway Atoll would transmit an unencrypted radio message reporting a mechanical failure. Specifically, it would claim that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and that fresh water supplies were running dangerously low. If Japanese radio intelligence intercepted the message, as expected, and reported it to fleet headquarters using the supposedly secure JN-25B code, and if Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted that report, then the Japanese message should state that AF was short of water. If it did, AF was Midway, without question. The risks were enormous. If the Japanese suspected deception, they could change their codes immediately, blinding American intelligence. If they ignored the message, the ruse would fail. And if Washington still refused to accept the conclusion, even with proof, the entire effort would be wasted. But without proof, the disagreement would continue, and Nimitz would be forced to gamble blindly. Layton took the proposal directly to Nimitz. Nimitz approved it at once. On May 20th, instructions were sent to Midway via secure submarine cable. The order was precise. Midway was to broadcast a plain English message stating that the water distillation plant had failed. The message was to sound routine, administrative, and unremarkable, not urgent enough to suggest deception. On May 22nd, Midway transmitted, "Water distillation plant has suffered serious malfunction. Fresh water reserves sufficient for approximately 2 weeks. Request resupply at earliest opportunity." The message was broadcast openly, without encryption. Japanese listening stations in the Marshall Islands intercepted it within hours. Station Hypo monitored Japanese traffic continuously. 48 hours later, they intercepted a message encrypted in JN25B. When decrypted, it reported that AF was experiencing a shortage of fresh water. It recommended that invasion forces carry additional desalination equipment to support post-landing operations. Rochefort brought the decrypt to Nimitz on May 24th. The evidence was conclusive. AF was Midway. The Japanese had confirmed it themselves. Nimitz made his decision immediately. All 3 carriers would concentrate northeast of Midway and wait in ambush. When the Japanese struck, American forces would counterattack. The original water shortage idea had come from Lieutenant Commander Wilfred J. Holmes, one of Rochefort's officers. It would become one of the most successful intelligence deceptions in naval history. Nimitz now faced another problem. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 2 weeks earlier. 3 bomb hits had torn through her flight deck. Fires had gutted internal compartments. Steering systems were compromised. Engineers estimated 90 days of repair work. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. When Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, more than 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed aboard. They worked around the clock. Damage control teams cut away twisted steel. Welders patched flight deck holes. Electricians restored critical systems. Carpenters rebuilt shattered spaces. Work continued without pause. On May 30th, Yorktown put to sea, still scarred, still imperfect, with repair crews aboard to finish work underway. Enterprise and Hornet had departed 2 days earlier. All 3 carriers rendezvoused at a point designated Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. The location was carefully chosen, close enough to respond quickly, far enough to avoid detection, and positioned to allow an attack from an unexpected direction. The American force consisted of 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and approximately 233 aircraft. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded from Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16 on board Enterprise. They were outnumbered. Japanese forces included 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, multiple battleships, and more than 248 carrier aircraft. But the Americans possessed 2 decisive advantages. They knew when the Japanese were coming, and they knew where they would be. On June 3rd, a PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted Japanese ships 600 miles southwest of Midway. The trap was closing. The pilot reported transports and escort vessels heading northeast. This was the invasion force, approaching from exactly the direction Rochefort had predicted. But these were not the carriers. The carriers would come from the northwest, striking Midway from a different direction to achieve surprise. Admiral Fletcher ordered his force to hold position and wait. The morning of June 4th began before dawn. At 0553, Midway's radar detected incoming aircraft roughly 100 miles out. Minutes later, the radar plot showed dozens of aircraft approaching from the northwest. At 0552, a PBY Catalina sighted the Japanese carrier force and transmitted a contact report with position, course, and speed. The report reached Fletcher at 0600. He immediately ordered all 3 American carriers to launch every available aircraft. The Japanese attack on Midway began at 0630. Bombs struck fuel storage tanks, the seaplane hangar, and the power station. Marine fighters intercepted the attackers but were overwhelmed by Japanese Zeros. 15 of 26 Marine fighters were shot down. The survivors landed with empty ammunition bins and heavily damaged aircraft. Midway's facilities were damaged but not destroyed. The airfield remained operational. More importantly, the Japanese had revealed their position. At 0700, Enterprise began launching aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the Air Group commander, led the strike. He commanded 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 16 from Bombing Squadron 6 and 16 from Scouting Squadron 6. McCluskey flew the 33rd aircraft as formation leader. The plan called for a coordinated attack with torpedo bombers and fighters, but the launch had been rushed. Aircraft departed in scattered groups instead of a single unified force. The torpedo bombers went one direction, the fighters another, and McCluskey's dive bombers a third. American doctrine emphasized coordination, but under pressure, it had broken down. McCluskey navigated using the PBY contact report from 0552, which provided position, course, and speed. He calculated an intercept point and headed southwest. At 0920, he reached the estimated location. There was nothing there. Only empty ocean. McCluskey rechecked his navigation. His chart was a small paper map strapped to his thigh. His instruments were limited to a magnetic compass and airspeed indicator. Overwater navigation in 1942 was an art, not a science. Wind drift, visibility, and small errors accumulated. He now faced a decision. His fuel was running low. In 30 minutes, he would reach the point of no return. Some pilots were already turning back. 3 aircraft had dropped out earlier for mechanical trouble. More would follow if the search continued. But if McCluskey turned back now without finding the enemy, the mission would be a complete failure. The torpedo bomber crews who had already attacked and died would have died for nothing. McCluskey decided to continue searching for 15 more minutes to the southwest. If he found nothing, he would execute a box search to the north. His reasoning was sound. If the Japanese carriers were south of his position, Midway's patrol planes would have reported them. Since no such reports existed, the carriers had to be north. McCluskey was exactly right. Throughout the morning, Japanese carriers had been forced into repeated evasive maneuvers. At 0710, torpedo bombers from Midway attacked, forcing sharp turns. At 0715, B-26 Marauders attacked, again maneuvering. At 0920, torpedo bombers from Hornet attacked, again forcing evasive action. Each maneuver slowed the Japanese advance towards Midway. Then, at 0917, Admiral Nagumo received a report that American carriers were nearby. He immediately turned his fleet 90 degrees to the left, heading northeast to close the distance for his own strike. At 0955, McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. It was Arashi. Earlier that morning, the American submarine Nautilus had attacked the Japanese fleet. Arashi had been detached to depth charge the submarine and now was rushing to rejoin the carriers. McCluskey assumed, correctly, that the destroyer was heading back to the fleet. He ordered his remaining 31 dive bombers to follow Arashi's course. At 10:15, ship wakes appeared on the horizon. 4 large wakes in formation at high speed. Japanese carriers.
McCluskey checked his altitude, 19,000 feet, perfect for a dive-bombing attack. Below him, the four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed in a loose box formation. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel lines were connected, ordnance carts stood beside planes armed with bombs and torpedoes. Every carrier was at maximum vulnerability. At 10:22, McCluskey gave the attack order. His formation split into two groups. In the confusion of the dive, both squadrons initially targeted Kaga, violating doctrine, which called for spreading attacks among carriers. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, recognized the mistake halfway through his dive. At 10,000 feet, his aircraft accelerating past 400 miles per hour. He pulled out, signaled his two wingmen, and redirected towards Akagi. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:22. A 1,000-pound semi-armor piercing bomb punched through the wooden flight deck, penetrated the hangar deck, and exploded below. The blast ignited fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions followed almost instantly. Within minutes, Kaga's hangar deck was a raging inferno. Additional bombs struck amidships and near the stern. By 10:24, Kaga was doomed. Best's three aircraft attacked Akagi. Best's bomb struck near the center elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck. The explosion ignited fuel vapors and triggered massive secondary blasts. A near miss disabled Akagi's rudder, sending the carrier into uncontrolled circles. Fires spread rapidly. Damage control teams were killed by ammunition explosions. By 10:46, Akagi's captain ordered the ship abandoned. At nearly the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown attacked Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led a textbook attack. 3 bombs hit in rapid succession, all penetrating the hangar deck and triggering catastrophic explosions. Soryu was abandoned at 10:45. 3 Japanese carriers were destroyed in approximately 4 minutes. From 10:22 to 10:26, the strategic balance of the Pacific War was permanently altered. Japan had entered the battle with 4 of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor.
By 10:30, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to strike back. Before being located, Hiryu launched 2 counterattacks against Yorktown, inflicting serious damage. Later that afternoon, at approximately 1700 hours, Hiryu was discovered and destroyed by dive bombers from Enterprise. Popular accounts often describe these events as the 5 fatal minutes, claiming Japan was moments away from launching its own decisive strike when American bombs fell. Modern scholarship has overturned this dramatic but inaccurate narrative. According to exhaustive research by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully in Shattered Sword 2005, Japanese carrier decks at 10:25 were largely empty. Strike aircraft were still below decks in the hangars, being rearmed and refueled. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was 30 to 45 minutes away from being ready to launch, not 5. The timing of the American attack was indeed fortunate, but Japan was not seconds from victory. The 5-minute myth originated in flawed post-war Japanese testimony, particularly that of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, whose claims have since been thoroughly discredited by historians. As his carriers burned, Nagumo stood aboard the light cruiser Nagara, watching the destruction unfold. He had commanded these ships through every major operation since Pearl Harbor, striking British forces in the Indian Ocean, raiding Darwin, and attacking Midway.
For 6 months, his carriers had been invincible. Now, in 4 minutes, everything had collapsed. Nagumo could not comprehend what had happened. All morning, American torpedo attacks had failed. 41 torpedo bombers had been destroyed without scoring a single hit. Then suddenly, American dive bombers appeared at the worst possible moment. How had they known when to attack? How had they coordinated strikes from multiple carriers without detectable radio communication? How had they found the fleet after repeated evasive maneuvers had altered Japanese position and course? Nagumo did not know about Station Hypo. He did not know about Commander Joseph Rochefort. He did not know that American cryptanalysts had been reading Japanese naval traffic for months. He did not know about the water shortage deception used to confirm Midway as the target. He did not know that Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his carriers using intelligence that revealed Japanese plans down to the day and hour. Nagumo concluded that American success had been the result of luck. He was wrong. American victory was the product of intelligence, preparation, and calculated risk, taken under conditions of uncertainty. At 11:30, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received news of the disaster aboard his flagship Yamato, sailing some 600 miles west of the carrier battle. Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation as a complex, multi-front campaign, dispersing forces across thousands of miles of ocean. The plan depended on deception, surprise, and the assumption that Americans would respond slowly and predictably. Now the plan was unraveling. 3 carriers destroyed, 1 damaged. American carriers still operational and striking freely. Without carrier air support, the invasion of Midway was impossible. Yamamoto attempted to salvage the situation. He ordered forces from the Aleutian operation southward. He directed his battleships to close for a night surface engagement. Japanese battleships outnumbered and outgunned American surface forces, and a night battle favored Japanese training and doctrine. But the Americans refused. American carriers withdrew eastward, maintaining distance and denying Yamamoto the decisive surface engagement he sought. By midnight on June 5th, Yamamoto accepted reality. The operation had failed. He ordered a general withdrawal toward Japan. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,500 personnel killed. Among the losses were 110 highly experienced carrier pilots and aircrew, men with thousands of flight hours and combat experience dating back to December 1941. These losses were not immediately fatal to Japan's air arm. The naval air training system could produce replacements, but not equivalents. New pilots entered combat with far less training and experience. The institutional knowledge lost at Midway could not be replaced. Japanese carrier aviation would never fully recover. American losses were far smaller: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, approximately 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel killed. Yorktown, crippled on June 4, was torpedoed on June 6 by the submarine I-168. The destroyer Hamon, assisting with damage control, was also struck and sank rapidly. Yorktown remained afloat for hours before sinking on June 7th. The casualty ratio was roughly 10 to 1 in favor of the United States. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, undefeated in major fleet action for over 3 centuries, the psychological impact was devastating. Japanese military culture emphasized honor, courage, and spiritual superiority over material factors. Midway demonstrated that courage alone was insufficient against an enemy with better intelligence, better technology, and greater industrial power. What changed after Midway was not only the balance of forces, but the balance of confidence. Before Midway, Japanese planners assumed American responses would be slow, poorly coordinated, and predictable. After Midway, those assumptions were no longer viable. Americans had demonstrated operational security sufficient to conceal carrier movements, intelligence capabilities capable of penetrating Japanese planning, and tactical coordination across multiple carriers. Most importantly, they had demonstrated a willingness to absorb horrific losses to achieve victory. The torpedo squadrons had been annihilated, but their sacrifice pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the carriers exposed when the dive bombers arrived. Japanese leaders struggled to understand the defeat. Admiral Matome Ogaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, kept a detailed diary. His entries from early June 1942 chart the evolving realization. On June 5th, he blamed inadequate reconnaissance and Nagumo's decisions. By June 7th, he acknowledged American intelligence superiority. By June 10th, he wrote of the need to fundamentally reassess American military capability. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, accountability was minimal. Neither Yamamoto nor Nagumo was relieved of command. No admirals were court-martialed, but the consequences were irreversible. Midway marked the moment Japan lost the initiative and never regained it.
No senior officers were reassigned in disgrace. The institutional response within the Imperial Japanese Navy was to suppress public knowledge of the defeat while quietly implementing internal changes. Survivors returning to Japan were quarantined. They were forbidden to discuss the battle with anyone outside the military. Casualty figures were deliberately falsified. The Japanese public learned nothing about Midway for years. The cover-up was so effective that many civilians did not become aware of the battle until after Japan's surrender in 1945. On June 15, 1942, Vice Admiral Nagumo's staff began drafting revised tactical doctrine. The effort culminated in a tactical manual issued in late July. For the first time in Japanese naval doctrine, aircraft carriers were formally recognized as the decisive weapon of modern naval warfare. Battleships and other surface forces were now to support carrier operations rather than the reverse. This represented a revolutionary shift in thinking. For decades, Japanese doctrine had centered on the battleship as the ultimate arbiter of naval combat. The decisive battle that would determine victory was expected to be fought by battleship gun lines, with carriers playing a supporting role. Midway proved this concept obsolete. But the realization came too late. Japan had already lost its most modern carriers and its most experienced air crews. Japanese operational doctrine also evolved, though unevenly. Admiral Yamamoto had favored dispersed formations, spreading forces across vast areas of ocean. The theory held that dispersion would confuse American intelligence and allow Japanese forces to concentrate rapidly once the enemy was located. Midway demonstrated the fatal flaw in this approach. Dispersion left isolated forces vulnerable to concentrated American attacks. Despite this lesson, Japanese commanders continued to employ dispersed formations. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, forces were again divided. The pattern repeated at Santa Cruz in October. Only after multiple defeats did doctrine begin shifting toward greater concentration. and even then, inconsistently. The most profound change occurred in Japanese perceptions of American capabilities. Before Midway, Japanese training emphasized American weakness. American pilots were portrayed as inferior in skill and motivation. American aircraft were described as technically inferior. American tactics were characterized as predictable and unimaginative. After Midway, these assumptions were no longer credible. American dive bomber pilots had pressed attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition. They achieved hit rates of approximately 15%, tripled the peacetime training standard. They demonstrated tactical flexibility, discipline, and composure under extreme pressure. Japanese pilots who survived Midway reported that American tactics were aggressive, coordinated, and effective. In August 1942, Japanese forces attempted to recapture Guadalcanal. The operation depended on naval support to transport troops and supplies. On August 24, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed at the Eastern Solomons. Japanese pilots expected to encounter the same obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers they had destroyed at Midway. Instead, they faced Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, faster, better armed, and far more survivable. Japanese after-action reports noted the change and warned that American forces were adapting more rapidly than anticipated. By October 1942, Japanese naval intelligence circulated assessments explicitly cautioning commanders against underestimating American capabilities. One report distributed to all carrier division commanders stated that American pilot training was now equivalent to Japanese standards and that American carrier operations demonstrated sophisticated coordination. These recommendations were tactically sound, but Japanese industry lacked the capacity to produce the radar systems, radio equipment, and damage control technology needed to implement them at scale. After Midway, the strategic initiative shifted permanently to the United States. On August 7, 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders expected to eject the invaders quickly. Instead, the campaign dragged on for 6 brutal months, consuming Japanese resources at an unsustainable rate. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines attempting to sustain operations around Guadalcanal. American losses were severe too: 2 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. But American industry replaced losses in months. Japanese industry required years. Admiral Yamamoto recognized that Japan was losing a war of attrition it could never win. In April 1943, Yamamoto planned a morale-boosting inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomons. His itinerary was transmitted by radio using the JN-25B naval code. Station Hypo intercepted the message. Rochefort's successor decrypted it. The transmission included Yamamoto's complete schedule: departure from Rabaul, arrival time at Bougainville, aircraft type, escort strength, and flight path. The intelligence reached Admiral Nimitz, who faced a difficult decision. Yamamoto was Japan's most capable naval strategist. Killing him would damage Japanese command effectiveness, but it would also risk revealing that American cryptanalysts could read Japanese codes. If Japan changed its code system, Hypo would lose access to Japanese operational planning. Nimitz weighed tactical advantage against strategic intelligence. He authorized the mission. On April 18, 1943, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters from Kukum Field on Guadalcanal intercepted Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. He was killed instantly. The loss was not militarily decisive, but it was psychologically devastating. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been the principal architect of Japanese naval strategy since the late 1930s. His death removed the one senior officer who truly understood both Japanese limitations and American potential. No other Japanese commander combines strategic imagination, operational experience, and realistic assessments of American industrial power in the same way. On the American side, the man whose intelligence made Midway possible received no recognition at the time. Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo, was not rewarded for his success. He was punished. Rochefort's direct reporting relationship with Admiral Chester Nimitz bypassed Washington's intelligence bureaucracy and violated established protocol. Captain John Redman, who directed the Navy's communications intelligence effort in Washington, deeply resented Rochefort's independence and his close working relationship with Nimitz. Redman lobbied aggressively to have Rochefort removed from Hypo. In October 1942, Rochefort was transferred from Hawaii. He was initially assigned to the Western Sea Frontier Command in San Francisco, a staff billet with no intelligence responsibilities. In August 1943, he was given command of a floating dry dock, a career dead end typically reserved for officers being quietly sidelined. Rochefort spent the remainder of the war in administrative positions far removed from intelligence work and combat operations. He received the Legion of Merit in 1945, but even this modest recognition was opposed by Admiral Ernest King, who believed Rochefort had been insubordinate and had violated proper command channels. That Rochefort's intelligence had decided the Battle of Midway was, in King's view, irrelevant to questions of discipline and procedure. The Distinguished Service Medal was awarded to Rochefort in 1985, 9 years after his death. President Ronald Reagan formally presented the medal to Rochefort's children on May 30, 1986. The following year, Rochefort was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Both honors came decades too late to matter to the man himself. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976, believing his contributions had been ignored and undervalued by the Navy he had served for more than 40 years. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey survived the Battle of Midway, but not unscathed. As he pulled out of his dive after attacking Kaga, 2 Japanese Zero fighters attacked from behind. They riddled his SBD Dauntless with 52 bullet holes. One round struck McCluskey in the shoulder, passing through muscle and narrowly missing his lung. His rear seat gunner, ARM-1 Walter Chokel, shot down one of the attacking Zeros. McCluskey managed to fly his shattered aircraft back to Enterprise, landing with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. 10 other aircraft from his squadrons ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. Their crews were never recovered. McCluskey received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. He later commanded the escort carrier Corregidor during operations in both the Atlantic and Pacific. After the war, he served in staff positions and as a naval attaché before retiring as a rear admiral in 1956. He died on June 27, 1976, at the age of 74. In his after-action report, Admiral Nimitz wrote that McCluskey's decision to continue searching despite low fuel, no confirmed enemy position, and mounting losses, and his judgment about where the enemy must be, had decided the fate of the American carrier force and determined the outcome of the battle. Without McCluskey's persistence and intuition, American dive bombers would never have found the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Richard Best, commander of Bombing Squadron 6, achieved a distinction unmatched by any other American pilot at Midway. He scored confirmed hits on 2 enemy carriers in a single day. Only 4 U.S. Navy pilots achieved multiple carrier kills at Midway. Best paid a terrible price. During his dive on Kaga, Best breathed caustic soda-lime contaminated oxygen from a defective emergency oxygen canister. The exposure permanently damaged his lungs and led to tuberculosis. He was hospitalized shortly after Midway and never flew in combat again. He was medically retired on March 1, 1944, at just 33 years old. He received the Navy Cross for his actions. He lived until October 28, 1991. In his later years, Best became an active participant in Midway commemorations and historical research. He worked closely with historians to correct myths and inaccuracies that had accumulated over decades. He was particularly insistent on debunking the 5 fatal minutes narrative, repeatedly explaining that Japanese carriers were nowhere near ready to launch when American dive bombers struck.
Admiral Chester W. Nimitz remained Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. From Pearl Harbor, he directed American strategy across the entire Pacific theater, coordinating Army, Navy, and Marine Corps operations over millions of square miles of ocean. Under Nimitz's leadership, American forces executed the island-hopping campaign, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese strongholds and seizing strategically vital positions instead. Nimitz personally selected objectives, allocated resources, and approved operational plans. His strategic vision shaped the Pacific War from Midway to victory. On September 2, 1945, Nimitz signed the Japanese surrender document aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Throughout his career, Nimitz consistently credited intelligence, especially the work of Station Hypo, as decisive. Without code-breaking, Nimitz stated publicly on multiple occasions, the Battle of Midway would have been lost, and the war would have lasted years longer, with far higher casualties. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded Task Force 16 at Midway, went on to become one of the war's most effective commanders. He planned and led the Central Pacific Campaign, including the assaults on Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. His meticulous planning and disciplined execution contrasted with the more aggressive style of Admiral Halsey, but Spruance's method consistently produced victory at acceptable cost. Spruance became Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in November 1945, though only briefly in the immediate post-war period. He retired in 1948 and later served as president of the Naval War College and as U.S. ambassador to the Philippines. He repeatedly identified Midway as the turning point that made all subsequent American victories possible. The Battle of Midway fundamentally changed how both sides viewed the war and themselves. Japan entered the battle convinced that cultural superiority, spiritual dedication, and tactical excellence would overcome American material strength. Japanese commanders believed their pilots were better trained, their equipment superior, and their fighting spirit unconquerable. 6 months of uninterrupted victory had reinforced those beliefs. Midway shattered them. Americans proved they could match Japanese skill, courage, and determination while also bringing superior intelligence, industrial capacity, and adaptability to bear. American commanders gambled that code-breaking would reveal Japanese plans accurately. They wagered that pilots with limited combat experience could execute complex, coordinated attacks. They accepted that torpedo squadrons would likely be annihilated, believing their sacrifice would create opportunity for dive bombers. Every one of those gambles paid off. The lesson of Midway goes far beyond carrier aviation or dive bombing tactics.
It is a lesson about information as the ultimate force multiplier. The side that knew where the enemy was, when he would arrive, and what he intended to do, possessed an overwhelming advantage. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo provided that advantage. They broke codes Japanese cryptographers believed unbreakable. They exposed plans Japanese commanders assumed were secure. They turned confidence into vulnerability. Midway proved that American cryptanalysts were not inferior. American pilots were not unskilled. American commanders were not slow or predictable. American industry was not a distant promise, but an immediate reality. Every assumption that had guided Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor was disproven in 4 minutes of dive bombing on the morning of June 4, 1942. The consequences were measured in burning carriers, dead sailors, shattered air crews, and a strategic initiative Japan would never recover. This is how wars actually turn. Not through destiny, not through inevitability, but through intelligence officers working in windowless basements, pilots making life or death decisions over empty ocean, torpedo crews flying into certain death to create opportunity, dive bomber leaders refusing to turn back when fuel was nearly gone, commanders willing to gamble everything on incomplete information and calculated risk. Midway was won by men like Rochefort, who broke the codes, by men like McCluskey, who kept searching, by men like Best, who improvised under fire, by men like Waldron and Massey, who led their squadrons into annihilation so others might succeed, by men who understood that being underestimated was not an insult, but an advantage. Japan never recovered from Midway. From June 1942 onward, every carrier battle was defensive, every strategic decision reactive, every resource allocation constrained. The offensive that began at Pearl Harbor ended in the waters northwest of Midway, because one side knew the other far better than the other understood itself. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories of the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to lifelong students of history. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.